Hello, everyone, and welcome to another bonus episode of the Stephen King podcast. This time I have as a guest author Craig DiLouie. Hello, Craig. How are you doing?
Hi, Lou. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. Thank you for coming on. And Craig is a speculative fiction writer. He specializes in apocalyptic, horror, historical thrillers, and sci-fi and fantasy. Have I left anything out?
That pretty much covers it.
Alrighty. So let's get into it. Your background. Could you tell us a little bit about when you got the writing bug, how long you've been writing for, and what were your inspirations as you were developing your craft?
Sure. I grew up on disaster movies in the 1970s, and and I love Planet of the Apes. I love Soylent, all those great old movies, and Towering Inferno. And I love the idea of ordinary people being thrown into extraordinary situations where they have to make these really tough ethical choices and fight to survive and somehow survive while doing what's right. And I had this idea when I was 9 years old that there would be this series of natural disasters that would hit all over the world. And Moscow would be buried under miles of mud and a tidal wave would destroy Washington, D.C. I didn't really get far beyond that. I just wanted to see the disaster.
Right.
So I didn't get very far with it, but that was my first writing excursion. Ended up reading a lot of Robert E. Howard. In my teen years, and then trying to be Robert E. Howard, writing stories. But I would start a lot of things and I wouldn't finish them. I was always chasing the next shiny object. It wasn't until the 90s after school that my school was finished that I wrote my first novel. And then for about 10 years in the 90s, I was in the old horrible world of traditional publishing where you needed an agent to get published and you needed to get published to get an agent. I would send out query letters to agents and on an assembly line, and would end up, some of them would use my self-addressed stamped envelope to send me back a form rejection with a little flyer which was promoting their own book, How to Get Published. So it's just nuts. And I was very shy I'm not a shy person, but I was very shy about walking into a writer's group or convention without having credits. And so which was to my fault because networking is so valuable.
Right.
But then, I wrote this book, this crazy little book where I was channeling Chuck Palahniuk on a bad weekend, and it was called Paranoia, and it was about conspiracy theories, and it was a really crazy book. This small press in Microbrew Press in the Northwest published it, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be like Chuck Palahniuk. Fight Club was this underground bestseller. That's what's going to happen to me. It didn't happen. It did okay for a small press around that time, 1,000 copies. And then he came back a couple years later, said, what else you got? I gave him a sci-fi novel called The Great Planet Robbery, which is sort of like Rudyard Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King in space. And that was a lot of fun to write. But that did the same, about 1,000 copies.
Okay.
And then I was about to give it up. My daughter was born, and I was having my midlife crisis, and I was like, I should just invest in my freelance writing business, which is technical writing.
Right.
But I had this nagging idea to do a zombie book, and ended up, because I always had the question, I like zombie books and zombie movies because I still liked apocalyptic stuff.
Right.
And how are these plucky band of survivors still around when the most lethal fighting machine in the history of the planet's been overrun? So I wanted to show the army side in a zombie apocalypse. So I wrote the first military zombie novel, Tooth and Nail, and that did extremely well. It exploded. And then I ended up writing 2 more zombie books for Bermuda Press. They did extremely well. And then I was like, okay, I'm ready for this now. So I was able to get the agent. I was able to get into a big publisher and with a vampire novel called Suffer the Children. And that was published by Simon & Schuster, the same gallery, the same company that published Stephen King.
All right.
And then from there got into self-publishing with a little dime novel series called Crash Dive, kind of Horatio Hornblower on submarines. And then decided I wanted to write another big idea, big book, standalone novel, and was able to sell that to Orbit. And that just came out, and I'm celebrating it.
Okay, and that's One of Us, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So what a journey. I mean, it's
Yes.
to an outsider, it looks like, a lot of writers talk to writers, and when they get a taste of it, they say, oh, yeah, just do what I did. And I don't know how to tell people that, because it looks like somebody falling up the stairs.
Right.
And so the only thing I can tell other writers is hard work and being at the right place at the right time.
Right. Yeah. Being ready to grab that chance when it's there.
Yeah,
that's right. Okay, I just want to break down a little more about your educational years. And that, did you take arts courses, English courses, or because you're a technical writer, or were you taking like computer stuff?
Yeah, I was an English major.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, English and communication arts was a double major. So after school, I was working as a temp as I wanted to figure out what I wanted to do.
Right.
I was an intern at New Jersey Network, this public TV station, and I wore a cardigan. I grew a beard. I was like that guy, and I was like, I'm figuring it out.
Okay.
I wasn't living in my mom's basement. I was living upstairs in my mom's house, and I did that for a year. And I had a video camera. I was shooting weddings, and I wanted to get into TV, but ended up had a word processor too, and was writing my first real novel, and had to make a choice. And I looked at my camera and my computer, and I said, well, I think I'm going to do the written word. And that's what I did.
Okay.
Ended up getting a job in advertising, worked my way up in the agency to vice president, and then got offered a job to be editor of a magazine in New York City, which took me all 3 seconds to say yes to that. And moved to New York and loved the life there, and was a magazine editor until I lost my job in a merger. Mm-hmm. And then went freelance and ended up in Canada after meeting a wonderful Canadian woman.
Oh, okay. Very good. Canada's glad to have you here. I'm curious, you mentioned disaster movies and Robert E. Howard. Was there other writers' movies? Because you seem to be into the horror SF, was like John Carpenter, Sam Raimi, that kind of stuff, your cup of tea too? Or? Well,
I love all sorts of movies and a lot of horror movies, although I tend not to get into movies that have torture as the main thing. And I tend not to get into jump scare movies. They aren't that fun for me.
Right.
But I love thoughtful movies like I love John Carpenter, and I love thoughtful movies that are coming out now. There's this real renaissance.
Yes.
Where fiction had a renaissance, horror fiction had a renaissance started a couple of years ago. Movies are really now enjoying the same thing. I really like thoughtful movies like It Follows, mm-hmm. The Invitation.
Yep.
The Endless, just really good stuff where you don't need a big budget to tell a good story.
Right.
And I think Hollywood has sort of missed that. They're like, well, we just want to we want to paint by numbers and it better than anybody else with a bigger budget than anybody else.
Yeah.
But it's still paint by numbers. I don't really care about the throwaway 5-minute inciting incident backstory for the character that gives him this haunted past. I don't care, because it's just so paint by the numbers. But like movies like It Follows, they're really thoughtful and challenging and just fun to watch. But on the writing side, those are my real influences. Mm-hmm. Geez, I read so many different authors, and they all have something different to teach me as they entertain me. But I'd say I could give you one off the top of my head, and that would be David Moody. He's a British author. There must be something in the water over there, or maybe it's the amount of gray sky they get, but they write horror better than anybody over there.
Okay.
For a small for a smaller country, United States, they have a huge number of fantastic horror authors, and David Moody's one of them. Mm-hmm. He wrote a series called Hater, and years ago when I was thinking about writing Tooth and Nail, my first real zombie book, and I started reading I found this author in the UK named David Moody, and he was self-publishing PDFs. Like that's where self-publishing was at the time, and it had a real stigma to it at the time. Nobody cared. It wasn't like it is now where you can't tell the difference.
Right.
It was vanity still.
Mm-hmm.
But I liked it. I liked him. Something about it. I wanted to get it, so I got all his PDFs, but they wouldn't download. And I was like, man. And I hate dealing with stuff like this. So I just wrote to him, and I was like, look, man, just refund or send me the PDF. So he's like, sends me the PDFs the same day. Was just this great guy, and I'm like, wow, I'm talking to the author. So I started talking to him about why he was doing what he was doing and how he was doing it. He was really struggling. But he wrote these books called Autumn, the Autumn series, which was a zombie series. Zombies like you've never seen them before. And he wrote Hater, which was about this thing that people just snapped and started killing each other, dividing humanity into an us and them. And he turned that into a series. Suddenly, this guy, Autumn, gets made into a movie. Guillermo del Toro options Hater, and St. Martin's picked up everything and brought it to the U.S. hardcovers in bookstores. And I was just like, wow.
Yeah, really?
And I was like, congratulations, man. But looking at his example of what he was able to accomplish through hard work and just sticking with it, and his approach to apocalyptic literature, which I thought was very realistic and wonderful, and the connection I had with him really inspired me to stick with it through small press and see what I could do, and to write these zombie books, which of course took off for me, and I ended up where I am today. And so I have to give him a lot of credit as an influence. And we're still friends, and he's a wonderful guy.
Cool. I'll have to check him out. I'm not familiar with his work at all. So that's one of the fun things about doing these podcasts, is to find out these new things.
Yeah, I'd read Hater. It has starts off a little rough. You have to get used to him. And once you do, you're hooked and on the style, and has one of the single greatest twists in a story I've ever seen. Cool. Where your empathy just completely flips, and you're on a totally different wavelength on the book. And as a plot point, it's one of the best I've ever seen.
Yeah. I really enjoyed your all the things that you brought up in your answer there, because I agree with you. I think horror has had a renaissance on the theater. I mean, for me, one of the best movies so far this year has been A Quiet Place, because it employed a dynamic which really forced the audience to pay attention to what was going on the screen, because it was the first time I'd been in a theater where you could see people were self-conscious about chewing their popcorn and stuff like that. So that was quite an experience, and that movie's not expensive.
I enjoyed that too.
Yeah.
And for the same reason.
Yeah.
It was as that movie is as audience participation as Rocky Horror Picture Show, but you're not supposed to say anything.
Exactly. Yeah, it's an excellent dynamic. I really enjoyed it. So it's very interesting, because your career has sort of mirrored what's been going on in the publishing world with the move from traditional press houses to the wild west of the online publishing. I'm wondering, do you find that the way you're approaching your work has changed because of that? Because there's a lot of writers. I don't know if you're familiar with the Prolific Writer podcast, but there's a lot of writers that they really try to churn out a pretty staggering amount of work in a year just to keep themselves going. I guess that's not something that's not a dynamic that you're going with right now, are you?
My output is a lot higher than it used to be, but no, I don't play that same game. I'm a full and a half time dad of two kids. That wonderful woman who brought me to Canada is no longer in the picture.
Okay.
So she's a wonderful co-parent now instead of a wonderful partner. I have a different wonderful partner. And so I'm a full and a half time dad, and I have a writing business where I do journalism and education in the North American lighting industry.
Okay.
That is a full and a half time job. So for me to do fiction, I somehow have to squeeze this into a very busy life.
Right.
So no, I don't commit myself to it full time, the self-publishing game, like some other people have done, where they're writing a book every 2 months.
Right.
For me, but it has changed my game. And here's how. So I'll spend a lot of time on a big book, selling it to a big publisher. That is extremely labor intensive. You're reading 100,000 words, and then you're rewriting 30,000 words because of what the publisher comes back with.
Right.
You can't just write it, have an editor give it a quick look, and then it's out.
Right.
Because you're always boom, 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 you're out. It has to go out. That being said, so that's a totally different thing for me. That's the traditional way where you can do a book a year, make a decent income, and you're happy.
Right.
And get a very broad reach automatically through bookstore distribution.
Right.
I'm also doing self-publishing, so I'm what's known as a hybrid author, where I have a foot in both worlds.
Right.
With self-publishing, I am producing faster than I used to, but I also write shorter. I don't believe in taking 100,000 word standalone book and selling it for $3.
Right.
And you can't discount it to promote it, because you're just throwing money away, and you're not going to hook people onto a series. So you really, in my view, when you self-publish, you really have to do a series, and you have to keep the books coming out quick.
Right.
And because they're ebooks, I don't care about length. So I do 40,000 word books, following the old dime novel model.
Yep.
So Bertel and Chapman in the 1860s came out with these dime novels. They were they were some of the first genre American literature. And these novels were around 30,000 words. They sold to a working class audience. They were pulpy stories, pot boilers, detective noir, all sorts of cowboy stories, military. And those stories were usually in a series where you had a likable protagonist, flat character arc, changing the world around him as he would go through these adventures, sort of like Conan, would be a great example of this.
Yeah.
Because the pulp magazines ended up because they could print cheaper, they took over the dime novel market. So I write pulp fiction with my self-publishing. So like I did Crash Dive, which is a series of 6 books. They're 40,000 words each. People don't care about the length because each tells a complete, satisfying story. So you see this guy on submarines in World War II fighting the Japanese Empire, and he joins the submarines in episode 1, and by the end, he's a captain.
Right.
And it's just, they're feel good, they're adventure, they're fun, and they just very sparing in the language. You have to tell the story very quickly. There's no bird walking, there's no meandering, there's no wasted words. It's very economical writing. Those did extremely well for me, but I had to get them out pretty quick.
Right.
You have to churn those out like every couple months. You have to have a new episode, or it starts to go dry on you.
Right. So that's your historical thriller series, then, right?
Yes, that's right.
Is that an alternate history, or?
Nope, it's straight up.
Straight up. Okay.
Military fiction, submarines. I ended up reading a book. I wanted to read nonfiction, expand my horizons. I was like, I felt virtuous, right? So I was like, I'm going to read a nonfiction book every 2 weeks from the library, right?
Right.
Look how cool I am.
Yeah.
And then I knew what was going to happen. I was going to read one book, and then I was going to like totally go off the rails and be so into it that I was going to want to write fiction about it. Right. And that's what happened. So I read these submarine reminiscences by Captain DiLouie, and fell in love with. I figured out like why boys love submarines, and I was like, wow, this is such a these stories are so great. And I love the technical aspect of it too. All the minutiae and how they dealt with the submarine, which was this fickle, giant machine they lived in under the water, and very primitive. And so I just fell in love with that. So I read everything I could about submarines so that the submarine would be a character in the book. So they're constantly dealing with the submarine. It's not like they fire one, and then then the submarine dived and it went away. Like, no, that's a whole chapter firing a torpedo. There's procedures, and it's weirdly monotonous, and yet so tension building because you know what's coming at the end of it.
Right. And
just like in Horatio Hornblower, which was about a young Forrester's brilliant books about a young naval officer fighting Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. He joins Nelson's Navy and works his way up to captain. Probably 50% of those books is just procedure on how to keep a ship in the age of sail afloat and going where you want it to go and shooting the cannons. Mm-hmm. And the rest is character and action, but like it just scratches this weird itch I think that people have for a topic in literature, which is work.
Right.
People doing work well and knowing their jobs well and having agency, doing things. And so these stories set on this submarine, they just were just a ton of fun to write, and they did extremely well for me.
Cool. Okay, circling back to what you're talking about with your current life situation and how you approach your writing. I'm curious, what's your work ethic for getting all this writing done? Because it sounds like you don't have much time in the day. Are you setting aside a certain time every day to write, or do you write in the cracks, or how do you handle that?
Well, I write all day, and I have a wonderful partner who's also a writer, Chris Mars. She's a horror writer, and so we have a lot of write dates where she'll come over and we'll just park it and just write all night. And
okay.
So I have to do a lot of juggling. That's the main thing for me. I don't have a problem getting to it. It's just getting it all done.
Right.
Is the difficult part. So I have to write a lot of lighting articles. I write over 100 lighting articles and other materials every year, which is quite a bit of work. And so I'll make sure I'm ahead of the game on that, and then I'll just jump right into the fiction. And I want to see that finished product in my hand, okay. So that keeps me at it, even though it's a lot more labor intensive than writing a 1,000-word article.
Yeah,
I'll just keep at it because I know what's coming at the end of it, and I believe it has potential to be read. And and published. And so I just that's how I end up getting it done, just doing it.
Wow. Okay, that's
somehow.
that's that's very interesting, because those are two different writing muscles, the business writing versus the creative writing. Do you have, I guess obviously you don't, but is there time? Do you need some time to switch between the two, or you can just do it because so quickly now because you've been doing it for so long?
I've been doing this for so long, it just comes right out of me. Yeah. In fact, it was great in the early 90s when I was in advertising. I started in their public relations department, and so I was writing every day, and I was like, yeah, this is just something you do. You don't write only when there's a monkey on your back, when the muse is like hitting you with a whip. And you feel this like incredible obsessive surge, like creative surge. I'm going to do this, and then it peters out, and then you go on to other things,
right,
or move on to the next project. Like, no, this is a discipline. This is a craft. You have to do this. And so the technical writing that I did actually taught me or contributed to my fiction writing in saying, this isn't some like burst of art that just explodes out of you and it's so wonderful. No, you have to write it every day, one piece at a time, and put it together, and then you have to edit it, and then you have to try and find a market for it.
All right. Okay. Are you a pantser or a plotter?
I'm a plotter through and through.
Okay.
But I think all plotters are pantsers because you can't outline everything.
Right.
So no, I don't think I've ever been quite a true pantser. I've always been a plotter, like point A to point B.
Mm-hmm. And
then I started adding, as I learned about craft, I started adding more points.
Okay.
So like Larry Brooks has this wonderful book, Story Engineering, where he talks about the 4-act structure and how all movies follow it and all good books follow it. And so I kind of go with that. And then I do character arcs now. So I'm always experimenting with different ways to plot out a story. But in between all these points in the story, there's discovery. So I am pantsing, but I am pantsing to something,
sure,
to a plot point, to something I want to see happen. I think that pantsing is wonderful. It's a wonderful creative process, and a lot of people swear by it. But I don't think it's very time efficient or labor efficient. Mm-hmm. I think you end up having to go back and do a lot of rewriting.
Yeah,
and I just can't afford that. I have to know where I'm going.
Right. Do you know the end of your stories before you start?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. My stories all start with point A to point B. I have a climax and a denouement in mind.
Right.
And then I start figuring out the character arcs and plot points that go between the two to tell the complete story.
Okay. One more writerly question. What software do you write with?
Microsoft Word.
Microsoft Word. Okay.
Yeah, but I have experimented with editing software like AutoCrit and Hemingway app, and they analyze your stories and say,
sure,
oh, these are repeat words. You're using adverbs here, and it helps me go back and tweak things.
Right. Yeah, I use Scrivener and Pro Writing Aid myself, but everybody, I'm just curious.
I think that's great. I just have never. The Scrivener, there's a cost of entry time wise, and and I get frustrated if it's not like
you're a technical guy,
completely intuitive.
Yeah.
I'm trying to write here.
Yeah.
And so no, one day maybe I'll make that switch, but Word's been okay for me.
Okay, that's great. Let's turn to your book. Your latest book, I believe, is One of Us, correct?
Yes.
And that is a apocalyptic story. Do you want to tell us the genesis for the story and what if about what the story's about?
Yes, absolutely. One of Us it's a dark fantasy, Southern Gothic. And so it's a Southern Gothic story that includes a fantasy element, which in this case is monsters. The quick synopsis is that in the past, a disease produced a generation of monsters that are now growing up and living among us. They have been relegated to orphanages where they're out of sight, out of mind. Everybody's afraid of them. Nobody really likes them very much. There's a lot of prejudice against them.
Right.
But they're now coming of age. Mm-hmm. And as they come of age, X-Men style, they're starting to develop. They have certain powers. And so as they come of age and see they have no future, they must now find a way to either fit in or use their powers to fight for what's theirs.
Okay.
And so it's been described by author Claire North as a girl with all the gifts meets To Kill a Mockingbird. And I think that actually nails it quite nicely.
Cool. Yeah, I've seen a couple of references to Kill a Mockingbird in some of the reviews. Is that Are you surprised to see that, or have you read the book and that's something that kind of got woven into this story?
It doesn't surprise me to see that at all. I really think that comparison nails it. The reason why is I wrote this as a Southern Gothic.
Okay.
And Southern Gothic goes back to the old Gothic literature, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where it's moody, atmospheric, the environment's in ruins. There's a supernatural element, and then that got transplanted in the U.S. as American Southern Gothic. And Southern Gothic is set in the South. You have these people who are larger than life, ordinary but larger in life. They stomp the earth, this little patch of earth they live on. Some of them aren't quite right in the head. It's very dark, it's violent, it's gritty, it's over the top. It deals with taboo and the grotesque, often deals with prejudice and a society in decay. And so I read a lot of Southern Gothic to prepare myself for this story. And I thought, what a great environment and story atmosphere to write a misunderstood monster novel in. And then that then ended up becoming a much larger examination of prejudice.
Right.
And I thought, because you had these very human monsters contrasted with these Southern Gothic tropes who are often very monstrous humans.
Right.
And so the story is about prejudice, but it's also about what makes a monster a monster. Is it what you look like, or is it what you do, how you behave, how you treat others?
Okay. Does it take place in New Orleans, or? It
takes place in a fictional small town in rural Georgia, back in 1984.
Okay. And the main character is Dog?
Yes. Dog, it's an ensemble cast. So Dog is one of the forward protagonists, but it really gets you into the head of a range of characters in both in the home, what they call the orphanage for the plague children outside of this town, and then people living in the town itself.
Okay, very cool. See that this is it's already out, published on July 17th, and you can get it at Barnes & Nobles and Amazon. It's from Orbit. And is there anything else about the book that you want to mention that I haven't asked you? Or
it's been amazing to see this published, especially seeing my work published in hardcover. It's really gratifying and humbling. I thought that would be the best part of the experience, but for me as a writer, always the best experience is just hearing from someone who read it and saying it touched them in some way or made them feel something. That is absolutely my juice. Like that is what gets me up in the morning and keeping at this.
Yeah, for sure. I think that, there's nothing better than for a writer to hear from his readers that this book really meant a lot to me. That's something that you just can't put a price on. Yeah,
it's been a really incredible ride. And I have another novel with Orbit coming out next year.
Okay.
And it's about a brother and sister forced to fight as child soldiers on opposite sides of the Second American Civil War.
Oh, okay.
So like One of Us, I think it's going to be pretty provocative and get people to reflect. That's one of the things I wanted to do with One of Us, just as I did with Suffer the Children, that came out a couple years before from Gallery. I like big idea books that hold up a fractured mirror to the human soul, as they say in the horror community.
Right.
And get you, entertain you and thrill you as a story, but also engage you on a visceral level through empathy with the characters to feel a theme. And then and to have that theme along with the story stick with you after, and that you'll reflect on it and learn something about yourself. Nietzsche said a single sentence can change your whole world, and which makes fiction magical.
Sure.
A magical opportunity. It's done it to me. I hope to do it to others.
Cool. I'm always curious for writers today, because of the advent of social media, which seems to have really caused a lot of polarization, and of course the political situations that we're seeing in the U.S. and other parts of the world. There's this real us and them mentality. So stories like You're One of Us and that I think are more relevant now than ever before. But I'm just wondering, there's this, they say fact is stranger than fiction. And I think what we're seeing in the real world now is pretty strange. Do you find that, how does that affect you? Or is it not something that doesn't seem to be obviously slow you down? Or does it make you think that what you're writing will be harder to sell to people because they're so tied up in what's going on in the real world today?
Well, yeah, it's tough. for writers these days because some readers confuse characters with the author. And
okay.
I don't, yeah. So if I have I had a character in Suffer the Children, or I had characters in Suffer the Children who were, a character was very religious and another character had guns in the house, and Publishers Weekly took exception to that this is a book with lots of religion and gunplay in it. And I was like, it is? And I think sometimes you get these reviews that say more about the reviewer than it does about the book, which is really disappointing. But that's just how it is. You have to live with that.
Right.
In One of Us, there's a character. It deals with taboo, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a character who in the town who thinks he's in love with a girl half his age, and there's a sexual assault scene. And these were very tough things to write because obviously I didn't want it to be gratuitous, but I did have to include it because I am showing these very human monsters contrasting with some of the humans being monstrous humans. And so I wanted to show the full spectrum of monstrosity in human behavior. And these are things that are monstrous behavior. But some people got triggered and they said, I don't like this, which is okay. Mm-hmm. But then they had to declare it to the world. Like, this has it in there in this book. It was almost like this book shouldn't be published, which I took exception to. I was like, okay, you're mm-hmm. doing a review to announce you didn't finish a book because you didn't like that a subject matter was covered that is upsetting to you or you think is upsetting to others, so you want them to look at you. Like, it was just, I don't know what to say. It's upsetting as an author because you start to feel this tug to self-censor mm-hmm. as an artist, and you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And now the plus side of all this is, hey, if you're a guy out there who's throwing in rape scenes and thinking that's tittillating, mm-hmm. maybe don't do that, guy. But that doesn't mean. So maybe some of this effect is positive, but. Right. Everything is a double-edged sword, and sometimes you feel the heat as an author who's just trying to tackle a difficult subject matter in a way that you think serves the story and isn't gratuitous, but some people get upset anyway. So that's a little discomforting mm-hmm. as an author. But that's just the world you live in, and these things there are lots of different trends going on. Like you said, the world's getting better and it's getting worse, and it's definitely getting more nuts for me as an older guy. But some of these things are good, but even the good things have unintended consequences. And so mm-hmm. as a writer, you navigate all this, and in the end, you want to please readers, but you ultimately have to please the story first. And so you have to tell a story that you think needs to be told in a certain way, and you do the best you can at it while being as sensitive as possible, but you really have to serve the story as your first, and then hope people like it. And if they want to read something and don't take exception to it, then you just have to live with that too. Right.
Yeah. I assume that you use beta readers to catch these types of potential hotspots.
Well, for Crash Dive, I have an editor. I hired a great guy named Timothy Johnson, and there's not a lot that's controversial in there. I mean, there's mm-hmm. some hatred of the racial hatred of the Japanese, which was common at the time.
Right.
So I had to be careful about how the Japanese were portrayed in narrative versus certain characters.
Right.
And so that was a bit of a tightrope, but I didn't think I needed beta readers to help me with that. I thought I handled that appropriately.
Okay.
And then with my big standalone books, Orbit is a fantastic company to work with, and they know what they're doing, and they have lots of people reading the book, and so they would let me know if I stepped in it in any way or
right.
In fact, just on the book I'm working on, Our War, about the Second American Civil War, I threw in something where a character was described as beautiful, and they tagged it and was like, how does this affect the character, and how does this relevant to the character? And I was like, well, the character said the other character was beautiful because that's just what people say. Like, you're young and beautiful. Why are you going to do this?
Right.
You have all these other opportunities. And they're like, well, why is he's saying she's beautiful? Like, the dad saying this to his daughter. And I'm like, well, that's just what people say, but okay, I take your point. And so I edited that. And I was like, okay, that's cool. That's cool.
Right. Interesting.
And so I have good editors at Orbit who they just try and they tweak, they just nudge you along, and they're nothing heavy-handed. And so I feel like I'm in very good hands with them.
All right. Very cool. I think that's everything I had to ask you. Is there anything that hasn't been discussed that you would like to mention at this time?
I just want to say thanks a lot for having me on. It was a great conversation. You're very good at this, and I was happy to be here and talk to your listeners about what it's like in this world of being this author, crazy, this crazy hectic world of being an author. And it's been a really fun journey, and I was glad to be able to share a little bit of it with your listeners today.
Great. And we thank you for taking the time to do that, and I wish you the best of luck with your new book, One of Us, and hopefully we'll cross paths.
I'd love it. And thank you again. And I just wanted to say to your listeners, if they want to learn more about my fiction, I'm in all the usual places, Amazon, Goodreads, Twitter, Facebook, but the best place the hub of all that is my website, CraigDiLouie.com, CraigDiLouie, Louie. And I review lots of books and movies, and so even if they don't like my stuff, there's something for everybody there if they like the speculative fiction genre.
Very good. Well, once again, thank you very much for coming on, Craig.
Thank you.
Have a great day.